They abducted women, subjected them to unimaginable torture, and mutilated their bodies, only to use the severed parts in twisted rituals conducted in a hidden attic shrine. And the man behind it all? He wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was a seemingly ordinary husband, a father of three, with a steady job and a quiet suburban life. Or so everyone believed. After living what appeared to be a normal life, marrying, having children, and working as an electrician, Robin Gecht carefully concealed a growing darkness within him, a hidden side that gradually evolved into a deeply disturbing obsession. Over time, he began to exhibit increasingly sadistic and sexually deviant behavior, with a particular focus on acts of mutilation and the brutal torture of women. Despite this ordinary exterior, Gecht harbored increasingly violent sexual fantasies involving control, mutilation, and ritualistic acts, fueled by pornography, occultism, and his own sadistic impulses. But Robin Gecht didn't want to act alone. His fantasies required followers. He wanted power, worship, and obedience. Robin Gecht first met Edward Spreitzer, a shy and emotionally vulnerable young man several years younger than him, in the late 1970s. Spreitzer was quiet, insecure, and lacked strong social connections, traits Gecht could easily manipulate. The two likely met through mutual acquaintances or neighborhood connections. Robin quickly assumed a dominant role in Spreitzer's life, becoming a mentor-like figure. He reportedly gave him a place to live for a time and offered him purpose, not through work, but through the ideology of pain, control, and ritual. Gecht indoctrinated Spreitzer into his worldview gradually, starting with conversations about domination and occult beliefs before escalating into discussions of violence and sexual cruelty. Later, through Spreitzer or through local connections on the north side of Chicago, Robin Gecht came into contact with Andrew Kokorleis, a young man with a low IQ and limited capacity for critical thought. Andrew was impressionable and submissive, ideal for what Gecht was forming. Andrew's brother, Thomas Kokorleis, would eventually be pulled in as well. Thomas was also developmentally challenged and lived under the influence of both his brother and Gecht. The Kokorleis brothers, like Spreitzer, lacked strong guidance and were easily influenced by charismatic authority figures. Once all three men were under his psychological influence, Robin Gecht began conducting strange meetings at his home, particularly in his attic, which he had decorated as a ritualistic shrine. It was here that the men were allegedly introduced to his cult-like practices. He convinced them they were part of a sacred ritual, one that involved dominance, sacrifice, and acts of terror masked as religious significance. Before we continue, disclaimer, this case involves numerous victims, each with their own tragic and horrifying story. But to maintain focus and narrative flow, we will only cover a select few in this video. After weeks, perhaps even months of indoctrination, psychological manipulation, and ritualistic planning within the confines of Robin Gecht's attic shrine, the group transitioned from dark fantasy into a horrifying reality. Fueled by a delusional sense of purpose and spiritual justification orchestrated by Gecht himself, the men embarked on what they considered their first mission. Sometime in early 1981, Robin Gecht, Edward Spreitzer, and the Kokorleis brothers set out in their now infamous white Dodge van, cruising the streets of Chicago under the cover of darkness. The van had no windows in the back, making it the perfect mobile prison. They weren't simply out to kill, they were hunting for a very specific type of victim, a lone woman, someone they could overpower, silence, and use in their twisted ritual. Eventually they found her, a sex worker, vulnerable and unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. She was lured into the van, either by force or through false promises of money. But once inside, the doors slammed shut and her fate was sealed. What followed was not merely a killing, it was a ritual. Inside the van, the woman was brutally assaulted, gang raped, and tortured over an extended period. The men took turns violating her while Geck directed them, not with shouts, but with calm, priest-like commands, as though they were performing a sacred rite. According to later confessions, Gecht was the one who wielded the knife. He cut her chest, mutilated her breasts, and treated the act not as murder, but as a sacrament. The crew collected the severed tissue and, according to testimony from Spreitzer, Geck brought it back to his home, where it was used during a private ritual involving candles, chanting, and possible blood consumption. The woman's body was then dumped in an alleyway or deserted area, discarded like trash, with no identifiers left to be found by police who, at that point, had no idea they were at the beginning of a killing spree that would haunt the city for years. Not long after their first victim was violated, mutilated, and discarded like a forgotten object, Robin Geck's hunger for domination and ritualized violence only intensified. To him, the first murder wasn't the end. It was a beginning. It confirmed that he could turn his fantasies into reality, and more importantly, that he had loyal disciples willing to carry out his sadistic vision. On a quiet Chicago evening, under the glow of streetlights that barely cut through the city's growing fog, the white van rolled again. It was silent inside except for the occasional breath and the sound of Gecht loading supplies into a wooden box. Knives, cloth for binding, a roll of duct tape, and candles for a ritual they would perform after the offering. Their next target was once again a young sex worker, a woman struggling to survive in a city that wouldn't remember her name. She was approached by the van, offered quick cash, and invited in. What happened in that van was terrifyingly systematic. She was bound and gagged, her arms tied so tightly that the marks would later be noted by investigators. She was raped by each man, sometimes simultaneously abused, while Robin Gecht remained eerily calm, sitting like a conductor in an orchestra of pain. Then came the mutilation, this time even more gruesome. With surgical precision, Gecht took out a blade and carved into her chest, removing her breasts entirely while she was still alive and conscious. According to court testimony later given by Edward Spreitzer, Gecht held the severed tissue up in front of his followers and made them kneel, as though witnessing a sacred event. They kept the body parts in a cooler. Yes, a cooler, brought with them specifically for this purpose. The woman was left barely alive, then killed, and dumped along a desolate stretch of land near a factory zone, left like refuse on the edge of the industrial wasteland of Chicago. Once back home, Gecht conducted a private ritual with the severed body parts. It was said that he placed the tissue on his red altar, lit candles, and performed chants. Some eyewitnesses believed he may have even masturbated or consumed the blood as part of the act. The attic wasn't just a room, it was a temple of horror. This second murder marked a turning point, not just in brutality, but in commitment. The crew was now fully immersed. Rose was a 30-year-old psychology student and a devout Christian, last seen in September 1982, walking home near downtown Chicago. She was not a sex worker, which marked a chilling evolution. They were no longer targeting the vulnerable, they were targeting at random. She was likely forced into the white van, like the others before her, But what happened after was different in tone. According to later testimony, she fought back fiercely, but the more she resisted, the more violent the group became, especially Robin Gecht, who was enraged by any defiance to his authority. Inside the van, she was raped and tortured, but the signature act, the mutilation, was especially brutal this time. Both of her breasts were carefully removed, and evidence suggests the tissue was once again taken for ritual use. Her body was later found discarded near a garbage dump, her wrists bound, and her face showing signs of extreme terror. One chilling detail: the medical examiner reported that the mutilation might have occurred while she was still alive, further confirming the group's desire not just to kill, but to inflict maximum suffering. In October 1982, just weeks after the brutal murder of Rose Beck Davis, the Ripper crew once again roamed the streets of Chicago in their signature white van on the hunt for another victim. But this time, fate intervened, because the woman they would target was Beverly Washington, an 18-year-old sex worker who had no idea she was about to face one of the most brutal attacks in Chicago's history and survive it. According to Beverly's testimony, Robin Gecht himself approached her and offered money for sex. She agreed and got into the van, as many others had done before her, expecting a quick transaction, not a sadistic ambush. Once inside, she was drugged, likely with sleeping pills or a sedative, and passed out. When she woke up, she was bound tightly inside the van, and what followed was a ritualistic horror that matched all previous murders. She was raped repeatedly by the men, and then, as with previous victims, Gecht used a garrote-like wire to remove her left breast in what appeared to be a calculated, almost ceremonial mutilation. But unlike the others, Beverly was not killed. Instead, perhaps, due to time pressure or a decision made on the spot, the men left her unconscious and bleeding near railroad tracks in the outskirts of Chicago, believing she would die from blood loss. But Beverly didn't. She miraculously survived the night, crawling toward the road in agonizing pain. When she was found by a passerby and rushed to the hospital, she was missing part of her breast, covered in bruises and barely alive, but conscious and able to speak. While recovering, Beverly gave police a detailed description of the van, the men, and even Gecht's appearance. Her memory was remarkably sharp, despite the trauma. This led detectives to match her testimony with a pattern of mutilated bodies that had been discovered in the past year. Beverly Washington became the breakthrough in the case. Her survival connected the dots, confirming that multiple murders shared the same modus operandi. Following her miraculous survival, Beverly Washington, while still hospitalized and physically devastated, mustered the strength to describe her brutal assault in detail to investigators. Despite being sedated and in extreme pain, she remembered everything: the interior of the van, the sequence of abuse, the man who approached her, and even his facial features, which she described as calm, like he was used to it. With Beverly's account in hand, detectives began reviewing previous cases, especially those involving women found mutilated with their breasts removed. They began connecting dots between cold cases that had previously been treated as isolated incidents or gang-related crimes. One detective in particular noticed the surgical nature of the mutilations and suggested that whoever was doing this wasn't killing out of rage, but out of ritual or obsession. This prompted them to cross-reference medical reports, victim demographics, dump sites, and timelines, slowly mapping what they now believe to be the work of a sadistic group rather than a lone killer. Officers began combing neighborhoods for white Dodge vans. Within days, they came across one that matched nearly every feature she described, registered under Robin Gecht's name. Rather than approach immediately, they placed Gecht under surveillance. Detectives watched as he maintained a completely normal facade, working his electrician job, interacting with neighbors, spending time with his children. As police gathered background on Gecht, they soon came across his close friend and subordinate, Edward Spreitzer. Unlike Gecht, Spreitzer was unstable, anxious, and carried the kind of demeanor that suggested he couldn't hold secrets for long. Detectives brought him in under suspicion, and after hours of intense interrogation, he broke. Spreitzer confessed, not just to one crime, but to multiple murders, ritual mutilations, and the existence of a secret group led by Gecht. He detailed the use of the van, the tools, and most importantly, the attic shrine, describing it so vividly that investigators knew he had to be telling the truth. Armed with Spreitzer's confession, police soon tracked down Andrew and Thomas Kokorelis, who initially denied involvement. But under pressure, and after being confronted with Spreitzer's detailed testimony, they began to crack. Andrew reportedly admitted to being present during several of the attacks, but claimed he was under Gecht's control. Thomas, more mentally impaired, was confused and inconsistent, but his statements aligned enough with the others to secure charges. The stories were consistent. Gecht was the leader, the one who planned it all, the one who demanded obedience, and who conducted the mutilations himself. When police finally brought in Robin Gecht, they expected everything to fall into place, but he was ice-cold and calculating. He denied everything. He admitted to knowing the others, admitted to hiring them for odd jobs, but rejected every claim of ritual, murder, or abuse. He never broke. Despite this, police executed a search warrant at his home, and what they found shocked even seasoned detectives. In the attic, they discovered a red-draped altar surrounded by candles, pornographic magazines, and what appeared to be dried blood stains on cloth and walls. The layout perfectly matched the description given by Spreitzer. Though there was no direct physical evidence tying Gecht to the murders, no DNA, no murder weapon found, the circumstantial evidence, the pattern of ritual, and the consistent testimonies from three separate men built a strong enough case to take him to trial. As the Ripper crew was formally charged, public interest exploded. News outlets described them as a cult-like gang of mutilators, and the chilling details of what they had done made headlines across the country. But behind the media frenzy, prosecutors worked methodically, building a case rooted in witness testimony, confessions, and ritualistic patterns, even in the absence of direct physical evidence for every murder. Thomas Kokorelis, considered the least intelligent and most mentally impaired of the group, was tried first. In 1984, he was convicted of the murder of 21-year-old Lorraine Borowski, a woman who had been kidnapped in broad daylight, raped, and brutally mutilated before being dumped near a cemetery. Though his defense tried to argue diminished capacity, the jury was shown his taped confession, where he described the ritual mutilations in chilling detail. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison, but later gained eligibility for parole. Andrew Kokorelis was also convicted, this time for the 1982 murder of Rose Beck Davis, the Christian psychology student who was kidnapped and ritualistically mutilated. His trial was filled with graphic descriptions, including photos of her mutilated body and details from Spreitzer's confession that implicated Andrew as an active participant. In 1984, Andrew was sentenced to death. He spent 15 years on death row before being executed by lethal injection on March 17, 1999, making him the last person to be executed in Illinois before the state abolished the death penalty in 2011. Edward Spreitzer, whose initial confession cracked the case open, faced two separate trials. He was convicted for the rape and murder of Rose Davis, and also tied to the murder of Shui Mack, another young woman whose mutilated body was found dumped near railroad tracks. In court, prosecutors emphasized that Spreitzer was not a follower, but an enforcer, brutal, active, and fully willing to carry out Gecht's orders. He was sentenced to death in 1987. However, due to changes in Illinois law and the eventual abolition of the death penalty, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. In 1983, Robin Gecht was only convicted of the brutal sexual assault, mutilation, and attempted murder of Beverly Washington, the one survivor who managed to identify him and describe the van, leading to the entire crew's downfall. Although Gecht was implicated by multiple confessions from his followers, including detailed accounts of ritualistic killings and mutilations, there was no physical evidence directly tying him to the confirmed murders. Robin Gecht was sentenced to 120 years in prison, where he remains to this day at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. He is not eligible for parole until at least 2042, by which time he will be over 90 years old. Justice was served, but not completely. The mastermind still breathes while his victims remain silent forever.